The rhythmic thud of the pneumatic hammers at Miller Dynamics usually sounded like a heartbeat. But today, it sounded like a countdown. Carla Jensen didn't see the 200-pound steel plate snap. She only heard the high-pitched shriek of failing metal a split second before the world turned into a blur of brick dust and jagged shrapnel. As she lay on the grit-covered floor, her ears ringing and a severed bolt clenched in her shaking hand, she realized the accident wasn't a malfunction. It was a warning. 2 hours later, deep in the windowless basement archives, the blue light of a computer terminal reflected off her glasses as she stared at a digital trail of blood. Millions of dollars meant for life-saving brake systems had vanished into a ghost company, replaced by signatures she'd recognize anywhere. Just as the file transfer hit 40%, the screen froze with a blood-red "Access Denied" warning, and the heavy thud of the archive door echoed through the darkness. A familiar scent of sandalwood and tobacco filled the small space before a shadow fell over her desk. And a calm, paternal voice whispered, "It's a bit late for research, Carla." The pneumatic hammers of Miller Dynamics didn't strike. They exhaled a rhythmic, bone-deep thud that vibrated through the soles of Carla Jensen's boots. She moved across the concrete floor of the assembly plant, her steps precise, a metronome ticking against the chaotic pulse of the machinery. To her left, a worker let his safety goggles slide down to the tip of his nose, the strap dangling uselessly against his sweaty neck. Carla didn't yell. She didn't have to. She simply stopped, her narrow face tightening, and pointed a single calloused finger at the man's eyes, then at the goggles. He grunted, snapping them back into place with a sheepish glare, but Carla had already moved on. The air in the shop was a thick soup of heated iron and aerosolized lubricant that coated the back of her throat. It was the smell of Ohio, or at least the only Ohio Carla had known for 20 years. She stopped at Station 4, where a puddle of hydraulic fluid shimmered like an oil slick near the base of a vertical press. "Clean it up," she commanded, her voice cutting through the clatter of the conveyor. The foreman started to offer an excuse about the morning shift, but Carla's eyes, sharp behind her thin metal frames, silenced him. "It's a slip hazard. Protocol 4.2. Clean it, now." She gripped her tablet, fingers tightening until her knuckles turned white. Every corner of this place was a potential grave. She saw the frayed insulation on the overhead wiring, the fine layer of combustible dust settling on the rafters. The way the workers moved with the sluggish indifference of men who had seen too many safety-first posters to believe them. Federal inspectors were coming in 24 hours. The plant was a tinderbox, and Carla felt like the only person trying to keep the matches away from the fuel. She turned to navigate around the main assembly line, her mind already 3 steps ahead on the audit checklist, when a sound tore through the industrial drone. It wasn't the rhythmic thud of the press. It was a high-pitched, metallic shriek, the sound of stressed steel reaching its breaking point. Carla's body moved before her brain could process the danger. She dove toward the floor, her shoulder hitting the grit-covered concrete just as a massive steel plate, weighing at least 200 pounds, sheared off its overhead mounting. The plate whistled through the space where her head had been a second before and slammed into the brick wall of the supervisor's booth. The impact was deafening. A cloud of red brick dust erupted, choking the air. Shrapnel from the rusted mounting bolts skittered across the floor like lead rain. Carla lay still for a heartbeat, her chest heaving, the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding her mouth. Her ears rang with a persistent, high-pitched whine. When she finally looked up, she saw the deeply notched dent in the brickwork, barely an inch from where her shoulder had been. She stood slowly, her knees trembling so violently she had to lean against a cooling rack. Above her, the severed end of the production line chain swung back and forth, its links worn down to polished, razor-thin slivers. Jensen, you all right? A voice called out, muffled by the ringing in her head. She didn't answer. She reached down and picked up a fragment of the snapped bolt. It was jagged, the interior of the metal showing a crystalline structure that screamed of fatigue and cheap alloys. This wasn't just wear and tear. This was a failure of the very marrow of the machine. Carla didn't go to the infirmary. She didn't go home to James. She marched straight to the administration wing, the fragment of the bolt clenched so tightly in her fist that the edges bit into her palm. She bypassed the secretary, her boots echoing on the polished linoleum, and threw open the heavy oak door to the executive suite. Arthur Sloane didn't look up. He sat behind a desk of dark, polished mahogany, the light from the window catching the silver of his carefully trimmed mustache. He was stirring a cup of black coffee with a silver spoon, the tink-tink-tink of metal on porcelain the only sound in the room. "We almost had a fatality on line 3, Arthur," Carla said, her voice thin, vibrating with a frequency that threatened to break. She slammed the shattered bolt onto his desk. It skidded across the glossy surface, stopping just short of a crystal ash tray. Sloane finally raised his eyes. They were gray and cold, like the winter sky over Lake Erie. He didn't look at the bolt. He looked at her. A small, patronizing smile touched his lips. "Carla, you look a bit peaked," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. He used the end of his fountain pen to nudge the bolt aside as if it were a piece of refuse. "Machines break. That's why we have insurance. Why don't you go down to the break room, have some water? You're being a bit dramatic." Dramatic? That plate would have crushed my skull. The links are worn through. The maintenance logs say they were replaced 6 months ago. But those are the original chains from the '98 install. Sloane sighed, a sound of weary disappointment. He pushed a stack of environmental compliance reports toward her. "The federal audit is tomorrow, Carla. I need these numbers reconciled, not ghost stories from the shop floor. Focus on the paperwork. Leave the grease to the foreman." He returned to his ledger, effectively erasing her from the room. Carla stood there, the silence of the office feeling more suffocating than the smoke of the factory. She realized then that Sloane wasn't just ignoring the danger, he was hiding it. She left the office, but she didn't go to the break room. Instead, she headed for the stairs, descending into the bowels of the building where the air grew damp and smelled of stagnant water and old ink. The basement archives were a labyrinth of gray metal shelving and cardboard boxes, a graveyard for the plant's history. The fluorescent lights flickered, humming a low, mournful tune as she sat at the terminal. Her fingers flew over the keys. She needed to see the money. If the chains hadn't been replaced, where had the budget gone? She pulled up the Brake Systems Series A file. This was the plant's flagship product. Heavy-duty Tormes-knee disky for commercial trucks. Dust settled on her hair and shoulders as she began the grueling process of cross-referencing. She spent hours in that dim light, her eyes aching as she chased shadows through the spreadsheets. She found a line item for $10 million allocated for the modernization of the casting molds. $10 million for high-precision German equipment. But Carla knew those molds. She had seen them that morning. They were the same pitted, heat-warped iron shells they had used for a decade, freshly painted with a coat of heat-resistant gray to make them look new for the inspectors. The deeper she dug, the more the floor seemed to drop away from her. The safety budget was a fiction. Millions of dollars had been paid out to a company called Nord Steel for titanium alloys and specialized bearings. Carla checked the state's business registry on her phone. Nord Steel didn't exist. There was no foundry, no office, just a P.O. box in a strip mall 3 towns over. Her breath hitched. She pulled up the final delivery receipts for the last batch of truck brakes. Every single one of them bore a signature at the bottom. A familiar, confident scrawl with a sharp tilt to the right. Arthur Sloan, her mentor, the man who had given her this job when she was a struggling young mother, the man who had sat at her dinner table and toasted to James's health. He had been signing for ghost shipments while the men on the floor worked under swaying, rusted chains. "Oh, Arthur," she whispered, the sound lost in the vast, dark archive. She turned her attention to the testing logs. Miller Dynamics prided itself on its zero-fail testing protocol. She bypassed the summary sheets and went into the raw data from the test stands. The screen flashed red. Graph after graph showed the brake discs shattering under high-stress loads. The failure rate wasn't just high, it was absolute. At high temperatures, the cheap iron they were using instead of the specified alloy simply gave up. And yet, the summary sheets, the ones sent to the Department of Transportation, marked every test as a pass. Thousands of trucks were out there, on the highways, in the mountains, carrying tons of freight with brakes that were essentially made of glass. Carla's hands shook as she reached for a USB drive. She had to get this out. She had to call the federal tip line. She plugged the drive into the terminal and began dragging the files. 10%, 30%, 45%. A sharp, digital chirp echoed through the room. The blue loading bar froze. A red dialog box popped up, obscuring the data. Access denied. Administrative lock. "No," she hissed, clicking the mouse frantically. "No, no, no." The cursor turned into a spinning circle of death. The system hadn't just stopped the transfer, it had flagged it. She heard the heavy thud of the archive door opening at the far end of the room. She scrambled to close the windows, but her glasses reflected the bright red "Access Denied" screen like a neon sign. "It's late for research, Carla." The voice was Sloane's. He didn't sound angry. He sounded disappointed. He walked into the light of her desk lamp, his overcoat still on, looking every bit the elder statesman of industry. He placed a heavy hand on the back of her chair. "I was just checking the maintenance schedule for the audit," she lied, her voice cracking. Sloane didn't look at the screen. He looked at her. "I was going to suggest dinner at the Old Oak. We could talk about your future. There's a VP opening in the Chicago office. I've already put your name forward." The scent of his expensive cologne, sandalwood and tobacco, felt like a physical weight in the small space, oily and cloying. He leaned in closer. "The world is a complicated place, Carla. Look out the window." He gestured toward the small, high basement window that showed the flickering lights of the town. Those houses, the grocery store, the school. All of it exists because this plant breathes. If the plant stops breathing, the town dies. The town is already dying if the brakes fail, Arthur. People will die. His grip on her chair tightened. A statistical progressionist. A few accidents on 1,000,000 units. That's just the cost of doing business. But if we fail this audit, thousands of families lose their homes tomorrow. Is that the right thing you want to do? He patted her shoulder, his hand feeling like a shackle. Be sensible. Go home. Sleep. We'll talk in the morning. Carla watched him walk away into the shadows. When she tried to log back in, her credentials had been wiped. She was locked out. She hurried to the exit, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached the administrative gate and tapped her badge against the reader. Instead of the soft green chirp, a harsh, buzzing red light flashed. She tried again. Red. Through the glass of the security booth, the guard looked up. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He picked up his radio. Carla turned and ran. She didn't go through the main lobby. She ducked into the service corridor, heart racing, her mind a frantic map of the building's exits. She burst through a side fire door, the cold Ohio wind hitting her like a slap. The parking lot was a vast, gray expanse under the yellow hum of the sodium lights. She hurried toward her car, her keys clutched so tightly they drew blood from her palm. She felt a prickle on the back of her neck. She looked up. High above, in the darkened silhouette of the executive wing, a single window was lit. Arthur Sloane stood there, a dark shadow against the glass, looking down at her. He didn't move, he didn't wave. He just watched, a silent gargoyle overlooking his crumbling empire. Carla scrambled into her car and gunned the engine. She didn't look back until she was miles away. But even then, she felt those cold, gray eyes on her. Sleep was a ghost that refused to haunt her. Carla sat at her kitchen table, the medal her mother had given her decades ago clutched in her hand. James was in the living room, the flickering blue light of the television casting long shadows across his tired face. He had worked a double shift in the foundry. He deserved peace. But there was no peace. The next morning, Carla didn't wait for the audit to begin. She drove to the plant 2 hours early, a copy of the Nord Steel invoice she'd managed to print before the lockout tucked into her waistband. She didn't go to her office. She went straight to Sloane's. She burst through the double doors, ignoring the secretary's frantic, "He's in a meeting." Sloane was at his desk, perfectly composed. He looked at the crumpled paper she threw onto his mahogany desk. "Explain this, Arthur. $10 million to a shell company. Fake titanium. I know about the testing logs." Sloane didn't flinch. He slowly stood up and walked to the door, turning the heavy brass key in the lock. The click was final. "You're a bright woman, Carla, but you're missing the bigger picture." He walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a stack of personnel files. He tossed them onto the desk. "You recognize these. These are the technical control sign-offs for the last 3 quarters. Carla looked down. Her stomach did a slow, sickening roll. There, at the bottom of every page, was her signature. "I never signed these," she whispered. "In a digital age, Carla, a signature is just a series of pixels. And according to the server logs, these were signed from your terminal, using your password." He leaned over the desk, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "If the DOJ comes in here, they aren't going to look at the man in the corner office. They're going to look at the quality control manager who certified the deaths of dozens of people. You're the one holding the smoking gun." Carla felt the air leave her lungs. He had been planning this for months. She was his insurance policy. "But that's not the only thing," Sloane continued. He pulled a glossy photograph from his drawer and slid it across the desk. It was James. He was at his station in the foundry, his face streaked with soot, leaning over the massive hydraulic press. The photo was high resolution. You could clearly see the hairline fracture in the cast-iron base of the machine, a jagged lightning bolt of impending disaster right above where he stood. "That press is 100 tons of pressure, Carla. It's held together by luck and a little bit of spit. If I call for an emergency inspection of that station today, James will be fired for gross negligence in equipment maintenance. Or if the press happens to fail tonight during the night shift, well, accidents happen." "You wouldn't," she breathed, her voice a ghost. "I don't have to do anything. The machine will do it for me. Unless you do your job today. You walk the inspectors through the clean zones. You tell them the records are in order. And tomorrow, James gets a promotion. And that press? We'll have it replaced by Monday." He was smiling now, a warm, fatherly smile. Carla stumbled out of his office, her vision blurring. She went to her department, but her desk was gone. Her computer had been replaced by a clean, empty workspace. Two men in blue security uniforms stood by the door, watching her with flat, unblinking eyes. "Software update, ma'am," one of them said. She reached for her phone to call James, but her hands were shaking so hard she nearly dropped it. She watched him through the glass of the observation gallery. He was working, oblivious to the sword hanging over his head. She saw the security chief walk up to him, saying something that made James tuck his phone back into his pocket without looking at it. He was a prisoner on the floor. The day was a blur of escalating dread. A distribution shield in the assembly hall shorted out, sending a plume of acrid black smoke into the rafters. Before the fire department could even be notified, Sloan's maintenance crew was there with cans of gray paint, covering the scorch marks while the air was still thick with the smell of ozone. When Carla drove home that evening, a black sedan followed her. It sat at the end of her driveway, its engine idling, a silent sentinel in the dark. She went to her mailbox. Inside was a plain white envelope. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a copy of her employment contract. The non-disclosure clause was circled in thick, red marker. The paper was torn where the pen had pressed too hard. Prison, she thought. The whole world is a prison. She tried to find the hidden folder she'd stashed in her locker in the ladies' locker room, a hard copy of the true brake tests. But when she opened the metal door, the lock had been pried off. The locker was empty. The trap was shut. The night shift at Miller Dynamics felt different. The air was colder, the shadows longer. Carla moved through the administrative wing like a thief. She had James's spare key card. He'd forgotten it on the dresser weeks ago. The hallway was a tunnel of silence. She reached Sloan's office and slid the card. Click. She didn't turn on the lights. Using a small pen light, she went to the bookshelf. She'd seen him move the panel once. She found the catch, and the shelf swung back to reveal a heavy steel safe. She wasn't a safecracker, but she knew Arthur. He was a man of habit. He used dates that mattered to him. She tried his wife's birthday. Nothing. His father's death. Nothing. She tried the date he'd been named CEO. The tumblers fell with a heavy, satisfying thunk. She pulled out a blue plastic folder. Asset liquidation. Her eyes scanned the documents. It wasn't just about the breaks. Sloan was stripping the company's pension fund to pay off personal debts. He was planning to declare bankruptcy after the audit, sell the equipment to a buyer, another shell company he owned, and leave the town with nothing but a hole in the ground and 3,000 unemployed workers. The floor beneath her feet suddenly buckled. A low, guttural roar, like the earth itself was screaming, shook the building. Then came the explosion. Carla was thrown against the mahogany desk as a shockwave shattered the office windows. Outside, the night sky turned a violent, screaming orange. The roof of the fourth cech, James's cech, flew into the air in a spray of fire and twisted metal. "James!" she screamed, though there was no one to hear her. She scrambled out of the office, the blue folder clutched to her chest. The hallways were already filling with a thick, yellow-gray fog of steam and chemical smoke. The fire alarm was a rhythmic, piercing shriek that felt like a needle in her brain. She ran toward the fire. The fourth cech was a vision of hell. The massive steam pipes had burst, filling the air with scalding white clouds. One of the main support columns had buckled, and the roof was sagging dangerously. "Help! Over here!" Carla pushed through a wall of smoke and saw a flash of yellow. It was Billy, a 19-year-old intern who reminded her of the son she never had. He was pinned. The hydraulic press, the one Sloan had refused to fix, had finally given way. The 100-ton base had shifted, pinning Billy's leg against a concrete pillar. He was covered in soot and blood, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it made Carla's heart stop. "I've got you, Billy. I've got you." She grabbed a steel pry bar from a fallen workbench. The heat was blistering, melting the soles of her shoes. A jet of steam hissed from a nearby valve, searing her forearm. But she didn't feel the pain. She jammed the bar under the edge of the press and threw her entire weight onto it. "Push, Billy, push!" She felt her muscles tearing, her lungs burning with the intake of hot ash. The metal groaned. Slowly, agonizingly, the press shifted an inch. Then two. Billy screamed as he dragged his mangled leg out from under the iron. Carla grabbed him by the harness and began to drag him back toward the loading docks. Seconds after they cleared the area, the rest of the ceiling collapsed in a thunderous roar of sparks and falling debris. She got him to the triage area outside, where the cold air felt like a miracle. She looked up and saw James. He was soaked, his face blackened, holding a fire hose that was barely sputtering. The hydrants were dry. Sloan had even skimmed the money for the fire suppression system. James looked at her, and for a moment, the world stopped. He saw the folder in her hand. He saw the blood on her face. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, a grim, silent understanding passing between them. Carla didn't wait for the paramedics. She turned and ran back toward the administrative building. She found Sloan on the back stairs. He was carrying a leather briefcase, his face a mask of frantic, animal greed. He saw her and tried to push past. "Get out of the way, Carla. The building is going down." "You killed them, Arthur. You killed this town." She lunged for his briefcase. They struggled on the narrow concrete landing, the smoke swirling around them like ghosts. Sloan struck her, a heavy, clumsy blow to the side of her head. But she didn't let go. She twisted the strap of his bag around her arm and pulled with everything she had. The bag burst open. Bundles of cash and hundreds of forged invoices spilled down the stairs like autumn leaves. Sloan looked at the mess, then at her. He looked small, a pathetic, frightened old man. Carla didn't say another word. She gathered up the blue folder and the most damning of the invoices and headed for the conference room. The federal inspectors were still there, huddled in the safe zone of the main lobby, looking terrified. Carla burst through the doors. She was a nightmare in blue uniform, covered in soot, blood, and the stench of failure. "You wanted to see the logs?" she rasped, slamming the blue folder onto the glass table. "Here are the real logs. Here are the invoices for the titanium we never bought. Here are the deaths you're about to certify." The senior inspector, a man who looked like he'd never seen a day of real work in his life, stared at her in shock. He picked up a sheet of paper. His face went from confusion to a deep, stony gray. "Where did you get this?" "From the safe of a man who's currently trying to run out the back door." As if on cue, the heavy front doors swung open. 2 state troopers marched in, led by a foreman who had seen Sloan trying to reach his car. The arrest was quiet. There were no grand speeches. Sloan was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed, his expensive suit ruined by the soot of the empire he'd burned down. The aftermath was a cold, bitter draft. The plant was closed immediately. 3,000 people were out of work by sunrise. Carla sat on the bumper of James's truck, watching the last of the embers die out. A federal agent approached her. He didn't offer a thank you. He took her ID badge and a set of scissors. "Snip. The company is in receivership, Ms. Jensen. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately." We'll be in touch regarding the criminal investigation into the reporting discrepancies. She was a whistleblower, but to the law, she was still a signatory. She was a hero to the families who wouldn't die in truck accidents, but to the men standing at the gate, she was the woman who had taken away their mortgage payments. James came over and sat beside her. He didn't say it was going to be okay. He knew better. He just put his arm around her, his hand wrapped in a thick white bandage. Carla looked at the gates of Miller Dynamics. The heavy chains were back, but this time they were wrapped around the outside, held by a federal padlock. The silence of the plant was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. She reached up and touched the metal around her neck. She had done it. She had made things right. But as she looked at the faces of the workers, her friends, her neighbors, she realized that doing the right thing didn't mean everyone lived happily ever after. It just meant that the truth was finally as heavy as the iron they used to pour. She stood up, her bones aching, and climbed into the truck. "Let's go home, James," she said. The engine turned over, a steady, honest roar, and they drove away from the ruins, leaving the smoke of the old world behind them.